She was born in Brooklyn in a small apartment where the sound of buses mixed with the laughter of children running through the narrow streets. Her mother worked long hours sewing dresses for women she would never meet. Her father fixed whatever he could find to bring a few extra coins home. They dreamed that their daughter would have a life larger than the edges of the city that held them. As a child, she spoke with a certainty that startled grown people. Teachers said she was too outspoken. Neighbors said she was too proud. But she carried a quiet flame that would never learn to bow. She spent part of her youth in Barbados surrounded by fields and warm light and voices that told her to stand tall. When she returned to Brooklyn, the city felt colder, but her will had hardened like iron under sun. She studied every book she could touch and listened to the rhythm of people trying to survive. She believed that words could move walls if only they were spoken without fear. In college, she chose education because she wanted to give what she had been given. A doorway, a reason to believe that intelligence was not owned by the wealthy or the white or the men. In classrooms, she spoke not only of numbers and letters, but of dignity. She told her students that knowledge was a kind of armor no one could strip away. Each night, she would sit beside the window watching the glow of street lamps fall on the faces of working mothers. She saw how tired they were, how they carried families on their backs, and she wondered why the people who worked hardest were the ones forgotten when decisions were made. She began to volunteer for community groups. She walked from house to house listening to stories of rent unpaid and schools without heat. She wrote notes by hand and kept them in small notebooks stacked beside her bed. When she spoke at meetings, her voice trembled at first, then grew steady like a heartbeat finding its pace. People started to notice. They said she had a gift, but she knew it was not a gift. It was a responsibility. Soon she was asked to run for a local political seat. They said no black woman had ever won there. She smiled and said, "Then it is time." Campaign money was small. Her posters were printed by friends who believed. She knocked on doors until her knuckles ached. She listened more than she spoke. And when election day came, the people chose her because they recognized themselves in her. She stood on the steps after the results were announced. The air was cool, the sky pale. Reporters pushed forward with cameras flashing. One asked if she was afraid of what waited inside the world of politics. She answered softly, "I have lived my whole life in a world that was not built for me. What could frighten me now?" That night, she walked home alone. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement. Somewhere a radio played a song about change. And she whispered to herself that maybe, just maybe, it was beginning. She entered the halls of power with her head held high, and the echo of her footsteps followed her through corridors lined with portraits of men who had never imagined a woman like her standing there. Their eyes seemed to watch her with curiosity, some with suspicion, some with disbelief. But she did not let their silence become her burden. She let it become her fuel. She carried a small notebook, as always, pages filled with handwritten thoughts and promises made to the people who had sent her there. She remembered their faces, the mothers, the teachers, the janitors, the young ones who wanted to believe that government could still hear them. She refused to forget where she came from, and she refused to bend for anyone who thought her place should be smaller than theirs. Each morning, she arrived early, her clothes pressed, her hair neat, her eyes bright with determination. She spoke on the floor about schools that needed funding, about food programs for children, about equality, not as a dream, but as a right. Many did not listen. They shuffled papers, whispered, laughed, but she kept speaking. Her voice carried through microphones into rooms where people had never heard such honesty before. They called her unbought and unbossed because she could not be controlled. Donors tried to sway her, party leaders tried to silence her, but she stood firm. She said, "I will not trade integrity for comfort. I will not trade truth for applause." Her courage was quiet, but unbreakable, like a river carving stone. Reporters began to follow her speeches. She spoke with clarity and warmth and fire. Young women wrote her letters saying they wanted to be like her. She read each one carefully and felt the weight of their hope. She knew she was walking a path that would not end with her, but begin with her. Then came a day when she looked around and saw that change was still crawling too slow. The same walls, the same dismissive smiles, the same excuses. And she decided if the world refused to open its doors, she would build her own. She announced that she would run for President of the United States. The room fell silent. Some laughed, thinking it was impossible. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Even her allies said the country was not ready. But she said readiness is a word used by those who fear courage. Her campaign began with no money, no powerful backers, just volunteers with passion and paper signs. They gathered in small rooms drinking coffee out of chipped mugs, planning how to reach hearts instead of headlines. She traveled from city to city, standing on small stages in community centers, in churches, on college campuses. Her speeches were simple and true. She said, "I am not running to win, I am running to be heard so that others will know they can stand here too." Crowds began to grow slowly. People came not just to see her, but to feel the possibilities she represented. Some shouted her name, others cried quietly in the back rows, because they had never seen someone who looked like them dare to dream so loud. The press followed her every move, often mocking her, sometimes praising her, but she never played for the cameras. She spoke as if talking to a friend across a kitchen table, honest, warm, real. She told them change would come not from the top, but from the hearts of people who refused to be silent. She faced threats, she faced isolation, she faced exhaustion. There were nights she sat alone in cheap motel rooms, her notes scattered across the bed, her hands trembling from fatigue. But she would close her eyes and see the faces of the children she once taught and the mothers who still worked 2 jobs, and she would whisper, "Tomorrow, I will rise again." The campaign went on through rain, through protests, through laughter and disbelief. She did not win the nomination. But when she stood on the final stage, she smiled because she knew winning was never the point. She had cracked open a door that would never close again. After the campaign, she returned to Congress stronger than before. Her speeches carried a deeper calm, a deeper power. She spoke about unity not as a word, but as an action. And those who had once ignored her began to listen. Years passed, and her influence grew quietly, like roots spreading beneath the ground, unseen but unstoppable. She mentored others, she guided women of color who came after her. She told them, "Do not wait for permission to lead." In her later years, she often walked through her old neighborhoods. Children would call out her name from stoops and windows. She would smile and wave, her voice still soft, yet filled with that same certainty from long ago. She believed that courage was contagious, that each act of bravery inspired another. And though her hair turned silver, her spirit remained bright as the day she first stood on those campaign steps. Her story became legend not because she held the highest office, but because she dared to believe she could. She proved that history is not written by those who wait quietly, but by those who rise and speak even when no one listens. And long after she was gone, her words still echoed in classrooms and rallies and quiet hearts. A reminder that change begins the moment someone chooses to stand. In the final years of her life, she lived more quietly, but her mind never rested. She watched the world shift and twist around her, the voices of new generations rising like wind through old trees. She smiled, knowing that what once felt like whispers had become a movement. She walked through gardens in the early mornings, feeling the sunlight on her face, thinking of all the people who had walked beside her through struggle and through hope. She remembered their names, even those history forgot. She carried them like songs inside her heart. When she spoke to young people, she told them that courage was not born from anger, but from love, love for justice, love for truth, love for the idea that every human being deserved to be seen. She said, "Do not let them shrink your voice, because your voice is your freedom, and once you give it away, it may never return." She saw women stepping into spaces once locked to them. She saw Black faces in places where only portraits of white men had hung before, and though progress was uneven, though the road was still steep, she could see how far they had come. Sometimes she would sit by the window in her home, a cup of tea in her hand, looking out at the city she had always loved. She thought of her parents, of the little girl she once was sitting at a desk in a small classroom in Brooklyn. She wondered if that girl would believe what she had become. She thought of the children she had taught and hoped they had found their own way to lift others up. The world began to remember her not just as a politician, but as a voice that had reshaped what was possible. Her speeches were played again on old recordings, her words used in classrooms and protests and campaigns. She became a symbol not of perfection, but of persistence. As time passed, she began to feel the weight of years on her body, but not on her spirit. She still spoke with the same fire, though softer now, like embers instead of flame. She said, "The fight for justice never ends, it only changes hands, and it is your turn now to carry it forward." In her final interview, she was asked if she ever regretted the battles she fought. She smiled and said, "How could I regret standing for what was right? How could I regret believing in the promise of equality? I only regret that I will not live long enough to see it fulfilled." When she passed, the world mourned not just the woman, but the idea she represented. The newspapers wrote of her achievements: the first Black woman in Congress, the first to run for president. But those who knew her remembered something deeper. They remembered her kindness, her laughter, her belief in people. In the years that followed, her name became a beacon. Schools were named after her, scholarships carried her legacy, documentaries played her speeches, and every time her story was told, a new voice somewhere found courage to rise. Students wrote essays about her, leaders quoted her words, and mothers told their daughters, "Remember Shirley, she never waited for permission. She simply walked through the door and made a place for others to follow." Even those who never knew her felt her presence in the quiet progress of everyday life. A woman elected, a Black child dreaming, a teacher refusing to give up. Those moments were her living echo. Today, when her portrait hangs on walls, it is not just paint and canvas, it is history breathing, it is hope remembered, it is proof that one life lived with purpose can change the shape of a nation. The story of Shirley Chisholm is the story of what happens when a person refuses to wait, refuses to bow, refuses to believe that power belongs only to a few. It is the story of courage that does not fade when the spotlight turns away. She taught that freedom is not given, it is claimed, and that change begins with one steady voice saying enough. And somewhere, even now, in classrooms and meeting halls and crowded city streets, there is a young woman speaking her truth. Perhaps she does not know Shirley's name, but her spirit carries the same fire. Because once courage is spoken aloud, it never truly dies. It travels through time, through hearts, through generations, whispering the same unbreakable truth: that every barrier can fall, that every silence can end, that one woman's voice can move the world.